Alright. Hello? Hello? Ah! Where am I? Where'd I go? One moment. Where am I? What are all these noises? One moment. Come on, where'd I go? Oh no. I seem to have disappeared into the tree line. Hopefully I can come back. Come on, where am I? There I am. Okay, hello. Hello, everyone. How's it going? I hope you're doing well. I disappeared there for a moment, but I'm back and better than ever. I just went to go snack on some cheese sticks or something. I don't know. Something along those lines. But I hope you're all doing well. Welcome back to another live reading of A Christmas Carol. Now, last week I didn't draw many members. Hopefully this time, because I think I did it on a Friday night. And people are like, I don't want to listen to live book readings on a Friday night. 8 of the hour, I want to go dance. No, I'm hoping on Saturday night it may be a little bit different. But we're going to continue our reading unencumbered. Hopefully some people drop by and aren't completely confused. But without any further ado, let's jump right into it. I have my book here. And we are going to pick up where we left off. So, last week we had just finished Stave 1. We're now entering Stave 2. So, let me get up here. If you are listening along at home, get comfortable. Get yourself a festive beverage, be it cold or hot, I don't care. Just relax. Make yourself comfortable. We're going to be here for a little while. This chapter is fairly lengthy. It's quite a bit. But anyway, without any further ado, let's get right into it. Stave 2. The first of the three spirits. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that looking out of the bed, he could scarcely distinguish the transparent window from the opaque walls of his chamber. He was endeavoring to pierce the darkness with his ferret eyes when the chimes of a neighboring church struck 4 quarters, so he listened for the hour. To his great astonishment, the heavy bell went on from 6 to 7, from 7 to 8, and regularly up to 12, then stopped. 12! It was past 2 when he went to bed. The clock was wrong. An icicle must have gotten to the works. 12! He touched the spring of his repeater to correct the most preposterous clock. Its rapid little pulse beat 12 and stopped. Why, it isn't possible, said Scrooge, that I can have slept through a whole day and fare into another night. It isn't possible that anything has happened to the sun, and this 12 is at noon. The idea being an alarming one, he scrambled out of bed and groped his way to the window. He was obliged to rub the frost off with the sleeve of his dressing gown before he could see anything, and could see very little then. All he could make out was that it was still very foggy and extremely cold, and that there was no noise or people running to and fro and making a great stir, as the unquestionably would have been night. As there unquestionably would have been if night had beaten off bright day and taken possession of the world. This was a great relief, because 3 days after her sight of this first of exchange pay to Mr. Ebenezer Scrooge or his order, and so forth, would have become a mere United States security if there were no days to count by. Scrooge went to bed again, and thought and thought and thought it over and over and over, and could make nothing of it. The more he thought, the more perplexed he was, and the more he endeavored not to think, the more he thought Marley's ghost bothered him exceedingly. Every time he resolved within himself, after mature inquiry, that it was all a dream, his mind flew back again, like a strong spring released to its first position, and presented the same problem to be worked all through. Was it a dream or not? Scrooge lay in this state until the chime had gone 3/4 more, and when he remembered on a sudden that the ghost had warned him of a visitation when the bell tolled 1. He resolved to lie awake until the hour was past, and, considering that he could no longer go to sleep than go to heaven, this was perhaps the wisest resolution in his power. The quarter was so long that he was more than once convinced he must have sunk into a doze unconsciously and missed the clock. At length it broke upon his listening ear. Ding dong. 1/4 past, said Scrooge, counting. Ding dong. 1/2 past, said Scrooge. Ding dong. 1/4 to it, said Scrooge. Ding dong. The quarter itself, said Scrooge triumphantly, and nothing else. He spoke before the hour bell sounded, which now did with a deep, dull, hollow, melancholy 1. Light flashed up in the room upon the instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, I tell you, by hand. Not the curtain at his feet, nor the curtain at his back, but those to which his face was addressed. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, and Scrooge, starting up into a half-recumbent attitude, found himself face to face with the unearthly visitor who drew as close to it as I am now to you, and I am standing in the spirit at your elbow. It was a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child as like an old man, viewed through some supernatural medium, which gave him the appearance of having receded from view and had been diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung around its neck and down its back, was white as if with age, and yet the face did not have a wrinkle on it, and the tenderest bloom was on its skin. The arms were very long and muscular, the hands the same, as if its hold were of uncommon strength. Its legs and feet, most delicately formed, were, like those upper members, bare. It wore a tunic of the purest white, and round its waist was bound a lustrous belt, the sheen of which was beautiful. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, and with a singular contradiction of that wintry emblem, had its dress trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it, that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright, clear jet of light, which all this was visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its own using. In its duller moments, a great extinguisher for a cap which it held under its arm. Even this, though, when Scrooge looked at it with increasing steadiness, was not its strangest quality. For as its belt sparkled and glittered now in one part or now in another, and what light was one instant, and what was light one instant, another time was dark, so the figure itself fluctuated in its distinctiveness, being now a thing with an arm, now one with a leg, now with 20 legs, now a pair of legs without a head, now a head without a body, of which dissolving parts no outline could be visible in the dense gloom wherein they melted away. And in the very wonder of this, it would be itself again, distinct and clear as ever. "Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold to me?" asked Scrooge. "I am." The voice was soft and gentle, singularly low, as it itself of being so close beside him, it were at singularly low, as if instead of being so close beside him, it were at a distance. "Who and what are you?" Scrooge demanded. "I am the ghost of Christmas past." "Long past?" inquired Scrooge, observant of its dwarfish nature. "No, your past." Perhaps Scrooge could not have told anybody why, if anybody could have asked him, but he had a special desire to see the spirit in his cap, and begged him to be covered. "What?" exclaimed the ghost. "Would you so put me out with worldly hands the light I give? Is it not enough that you are one with those passions made this cap, and force me through whole trains of years to wear it low upon my brow?" Scrooge reverently disclaimed all intention to offend, or any knowledge of having wilfully bonneted the spirit at any period of his life. He then made bold to inquire what business brought him there. "Your welfare," said the ghost. Scrooge expressed himself much obliged, but could not help thinking that a night of unbroken rest would have been more conducive to that end. The spirit must have heard his thinking, for it said immediately, "Your reclamation, then. Take heed." It put out its strong hand as it spoke, and clasped him gently at the arm. Conducive. It put its strong hand as it spoke, and then clasped it gently with his arm. "Rise and walk with me." It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted to pedestrian purposes, that the bed was warm, and the thermometer a long way below freezing, that he was clad but lightly in his slippers, dressing gown, and nightcap, and that he had cold upon him at that time. The grasp, though gentle as a woman's hand, was not to be resisted. He rose, but finding that the spirit made towards the window, clasped its robe in supplication. "I am mortal," Scrooge remonstrated, "and liable to fall." "Bear but a touch of my hand there," said the spirit, laying it upon his heart, "and you shall be held in more than this." As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall and stood out on an open country road, with fields on either side. The city had entirely vanished, not a vestige of what was to be seen. The darkness and the mist had vanished with it, for it was a clear, cold winter day with snow upon the ground. "Good heaven!" said Scrooge, clasping his hands together as he looked about him. "I was bred in this place. I was a boy here." A moment, folks. I'm going to take a sip. If you're wondering what I'm drinking cranberry juice. Anyway, there we go. Where were we? Here we were. The spirit gazed upon him mildly. Its gentle touch, though it had been light and instantaneous, appeared still present to the old man's sense of feeling. He was conscious of 1,000 odors floating in the air, each one connected with 1,000 thoughts and hopes and joys and cares long, long forgotten. "Your lip is trembling," said the ghost. And what is this upon your cheek?" Scrooge muttered, with an unusual clattering in his voice, that it was a pimple, and begged the ghost to lead him where he could. You recollect the way?" inquired the spirit. "Remember it?" said Scrooge with fervor. "I could walk it blindfold." "Strange to have forgotten it for so many years," observed the ghost. "Let us go on." They walked along the road, Scrooge recognizing every gate, post and tree, until the little market town appeared in the distance, with its bridge, its church, and winding river. Some shaggy ponies now were still seen trotting towards them, with boys upon their backs, who called to other boys in country gigs and carts, driven by farmers. All these boys were in great spirits, and shouted to each other, until the broad fields were so full of merry music that the crisp air laughed to hear it. "These are but shadows of things that have been," said the ghost. "They have no consciousness of us." The jocund travelers came on, and as they came, Scrooge knew and named every one. Why was he rejoiced beyond all bounds to see them? Why did his cold eye glisten and his heart leap up as they went past? Why was he filled with gladness when he heard them give each other Merry Christmas, and as they parted at crossing roads and byways for their several homes? What was Merry Christmas to Scrooge? Out upon Merry Christmas! What good had it ever done him? "The school is not quite deserted," said the ghost. "A solitary child, neglected by his friends, is left there still." Scrooge said he knew it, and he sobbed. They left the high road by a well-remembered lane, and soon approached a mansion of dull red brick, with little weathercock-surmounted cupola on the roof, and a bell hanging in it. It was a large house, but one of the broken fortunes, for the spacious offices were little used. Their walls were damp and mossy, their windows broken, and their gates decayed. Fowls clucked and strutted in the stables, and the coach-houses and sheds were overrun with grasses. Nor was it more relative to a Smelly Twitch hasn't let me log in for 15 minutes. I'm sorry, Dommy, but I'm glad you're able to join me here. Let's see, where was I last? Oh, here we go. Nor was it more retentive of its ancient state within, for entering the dreary hallway and glancing through the open doors of many rooms, they found them poorly furnished, cold, and vast. There was an earthly savor in the air, a chilly bareness in the place, which associated itself somehow with too much getting up by candlelight and too much to eat. They went, the ghost and Scrooge, across the hall to a door at the back of the house. It opened before them, and it disclosed a long, bare, melancholy room, made bare still by lanes of plain deal forms and desks. At one of these, a lonely boy was reading near a feeble fire, and Scrooge sat down upon a form and wept to see his poor forgotten self as he had used to be. Not a latent echo in the house, not a squeak and a scuffle from the mice behind the paneling, not a drip from the half-thawed waterspout in the dull yard behind, not a sigh among the leafless boughs of another despondent polar, not the idle swinging of an empty storehouse door, no, not a clicking in the fire, but fell upon the heart of Scrooge with softening influence, and gave a freer passage to his tears. The ghost touched him on the arm, and pointed to his younger self, intent upon his reading. Suddenly, a man in foreign garments, wonderfully real and distinct to look at, stood outside the window, with an axe stuck in his belt, and leading an ass laden with wood from the bridle. "Why, it's Ali Baba!" Scrooge exclaimed in ecstasy. "It's the dear old honest Ali Baba. Yes, I know. One Christmas time when yonder solitary child was left here all alone, he did come for the first time, just like that. Poor boy. And Valentine," said Scrooge. "And his wild brother Orson. There they go. That's his name who put down in drawers asleep at the gate of Damascus. Don't you see him? And the Sultan's groom turned upside down by the Jenny, and the Jenny, and there upon its head. Serve him right. I'm glad of it. What business he had to be married to the princess? Dear Scrooge, expending all the earnestness of his nature on such subjects, in a most extraordinary voice, between laughing and crying, to see his heightened and excited face would have been a surprise to the business friends in the city indeed. "There's the parrot!" cried Scrooge. "Green body and yellow tail, with a thing like a lettuce growth out of the top of its head. There it is! Poor Robin Crusoe, he called him. And when he came home again after sailing around the island, poor Robin Crusoe. Where have you been, Robin Crusoe? The man thought he was dreaming, and he wasn't. It was the parrot, you know. There goes Friday, running for the life to the little creek. Hallo, halloha, halloop, hallo!" Then, with a rapidity of transition very foreign to his usual character, he said in pity for his former self, "Poor boy," and cried again. "I wish," Scrooge muttered, putting his hand in his pocket and looking upon him with drying his eyes with his cuff. "But it's too late now." "What is the matter?" asked the spirit. "Nothing," said Scrooge. "Nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. I should have liked to given him something, that's all." The ghost smiled thoughtfully and waved its hand, saying as it did so, "Let us see another Christmas." Scrooge's former self grew larger at the words, and the room became a little bit darker and more dirty. The panels shrunk and the windows cracked. Fragments of plaster fell out of the ceiling, and the naked laths were shown instead. But how all this was brought about, Scrooge knew no more than you do. He only knew that it was quite correct, that everything had happened so, and there he was, alone again, when all the other boys had gone home for the jolly holidays. He was not reading now, but walking up and down despairingly. Scrooge looked at the ghost, and with a mournful shaking of his head, glanced anxiously towards the door. It opened, and a little girl, much younger than the boy, came darting in, and putting her arms around his neck, and often kissing him, addressed him as her. "Dear, dear brother!" "I have come to bring you home, dear brother," the child, clasping her tiny hands and bending down to laugh. "To bring you home, home, home." "Home, little Fan?" returned the boy. "Yes," said the child, brimming of glee. "Home, for good and all. Home for ever and ever. Father is so much kinder than he used to be, that home's like heaven. He spoke so gently to me one dear night when I was going to bed that I was not afraid to ask him once more if you might come home, and he said yes, you should, and sent me in a coach to bring you. And you're going to be a man," said the child, opening her eyes, "and you are never to come back here, but first we're to be together all Christmas long, and have the merriest time in the world." "You are quite a woman, little Fan," exclaimed the boy. She clapped her hands and laughed, and tried to touch his head, but being too little, laughed again, and stood on tiptoe to embrace him. Then she began to drag him in her childish eagerness towards the door, and he, nothing loth to go, accompanied her. A terrible voice in the hall cried, "Bring down Master Scrooge's box there!" And in the hall appeared the schoolmaster himself, who glared on Master Scrooge with a ferocious condescension, and threw him into a dreadful state of mind by shaking hands with him. He then conveyed him and his sister into the veriest old well of a shivering best parlor that ever had been, where the maps upon the wall and the celestial and terrestrial globes in the windows were waxy with cold. Here he was produced a decanter of curiously light wine and a block of curiously heavy cake, and administered installments of those dainties to the young people at the same time, sending out a meager servant to offer a glass of something to the postboy, who answered that he thanked the gentleman, but if it was the same tap as he had tasted before, he had rather not. Scrooge's trunk being by his time tied on the top of the case, the child bade the schoolmaster goodbye, and right willingly, getting into it, drove gaily down the gardening sweep, and the quick wheels dashing and hoarfrost and snow from off the dark leaves of the evergreens like a spray. Always a delicate creature whom a breath might have withered, said the ghost. But she had a large heart. So she had, cried Scrooge. But you're right. I will not gainsay it, spirit. God forbid it. She died a woman, said the ghost, and had, as I think, children. One child, Scrooge returned. True, said the ghost. Your nephew. Scrooge seemed uneasy in his mind and answered briefly, Yes. Although they had but the moment left school behind them, they were now in the busy thoroughfares of the city, where shadowy passengers passed and repassed, where shadowy carts and coaches battled for the way, and the strife and tumult of the real city were. It was made plain enough by the dressing of the shops, and here too was Christmas time again, but it was evening, and the streets were lit up. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse, and asked Scrooge if he knew it. Know it, said Scrooge. I was apprenticed here. They went in, and at sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig, sitting behind such a high desk that it had been 2 inches taller, he must have knocked his head against the ceiling. Scrooge cried in great excitement, Why, it's old Fezziwig! Bless his heart! It's Fezziwig alive again! Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, laughed all over himself from his shoes to his organ of benevolence, and, and called out in a comfortable, oily, rich, fat, jovial voice, Yo-ho here, Ebenezer, Dick! Scrooge's former self, now a grown young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow apprentice. Dick Wilkins, to be sure, said Scrooge to the ghost. Bless me, yes, there he is. He was very much attached to me, was Dick. Poor Dick, dear, dear. Yo-ho, my boys, said Fezziwig. No more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Dick, Christmas, Ebenezer. Let's have the shutters up, cried the old Fezziwig, with a sharp clap of his hands, before a man can say Jack Robinson. You wouldn't believe how those two fellows went at it. They charged into the streets with the shutters, 1, 2, 3, had 'em up in their place, 4, 5, 6, barred 'em and pinned 'em, 7, 8, 9, and came back before you could got to 12, panting like racehorses. Hilly-ho! Cried old Fezziwig, skipping down from the high desk with wonderful agility. Clear away, my lads. Let's have lots of room here. Hilly-ho! Dick, cheery up, Ebenezer. Clear away! There was nothing they wouldn't have cleared away or couldn't have cleared away with old Fezziwig looking on. It was done in a minute. Every movable was packed off as if it were dismissed from the public life forevermore, and the floor was swept and watered, and the lamps were trimmed, and the fuel had heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was snug and warm and dry and bright a ballroom as you could desire to see upon a winter's night. In came a fiddler with a music box, and went up the lofty desk, and made an orchestra of it, and tuned like 50 stomach aches. It came In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast substantial smile. In came 3 Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came the 6 young followers whose hearts they broke. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. In came the housemaid with her cousin, the baker. In came the cook with her brother's particular friend, the milkman. In came the boy from over the way, who suspected of not having board enough for his master, trying to hide himself behind the girl from the next door, but one who is proven to have her ears pulled by her mistress. In they all came, one after another, more shyly, more boldly, some gracefully, some awkwardly, some pushing, some pulling. In they all came, anyhow and everyhow. Away they all went, 20 couple at once, hands half round and back again and the other way, down the middle and up again, round and round in vast stages of affectionate grouping. Old top couple a ways turning up in the wrong place. New top couple starting off again. And as soon as they got there, all top couples at last, and not a bottom one to help them. When this result was brought about, old Fezziwig, clapping his hands to stop the dance, cried out, "Well done!" And the fiddler plunged his hot face into a pot of porter, and specifically provided for the purpose. But scorning rest upon his appearance, he instantly began again, though there was no dancers yet, as if the other fiddler had been carried home exhausted on a shutter, and he was a brand new man resolved to beat him out of sight or perish. Fezziwig's Rubber Chicken Factory Pog. I just read that. There were more dances, and there were more forfeits, and there were more dances, and there was cake, and there was negus, and there was a great piece of cold roast, and there was a great piece of cold boiled, and there were minced pies and plenty of beer. But the great effect of the evening came after the roast and boiled, when the fiddler, an artful dog, mind, the sort of man who knew his business better than you or I could have told it to him, struck up Sir Roger de Coverley. The old Fezziwig stood out to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig. Top couple, too, with a good stiff piece of work cut out for them, 2 or 3 and 20 a pair of partners, people who were not to be trifled with, people who would dance and had no notion of walking. But if there had been twice as many, 4 times, old Fezziwig would have been a match for them, as so could Mrs. Fezziwig. As to her, she was worthy to be his partner in every sense of the term. It's that not high praise, tell me higher, and I'll use it. As positive light appeared to issue from Fezziwig's calves. They shone in every part of their dance like moons, and couldn't have predicted at any given time what would have become of them next. And when old Fezziwig and Mrs. Fezziwig had gone through the whole dance, advance and retire, hold hands with your partner, bow and curtsy. Bow and curtsy, corkscrew, thread the needle, and back again to your place. Fezziwig cut so deftly that he appeared to wink with his legs, and came upon his feet again without a stagger. Wow, Fezziwig can really get down. Anyway, when the clock struck 11, the domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side of the door, shaking hands with every person individually as he or she went out wished him or her a Merry Christmas. When everybody had retired but the 2 prentices, they did the same to them, and thus the cheerful voices died away, and the lads were left to their beds, which were under a counter in the back shop. During the whole of the time, Scrooge had acted like a man out of his wits. His heart and soul were in the scene, and with his former self. He corroborated everything, remembered everything, enjoyed everything, and underwent the strangest agitation. It was not until now, when the bright faces of his former self and Dick were turned from from them, then he remembered the ghost, and became conscious that it was looking full upon him, while the light upon his head burnt very clear. I mean, that yoinky spoinky. I guess so. It sounds like he actually did like the stanky leg or something. But anyway, a small matter, said the ghost, to make these silly folks so full of gratitude. Small? Echoed Scrooge. The spirit sighed to him to listen to the two apprentices who were pouring out their hearts in praise of Fezziwig, and then he had done so, said, Why, is it not? Oh, why is it not? He has spent but a few pounds of your mortal money. 3 or 4, perhaps. Is that so much that he deserves this praise? Isn't that, said Scrooge, heated by the remark, and sensing unconsciously like his former, not his latter self. It isn't that, Spirit. He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. Say that his power lies in words and looks, and things so slight and insignificant that impossible to add and count up. What then? The happiness he gives is quite as great as if the cost of a fortune. He felt the spirit's glance and stopped. What is the matter? Said the ghost. Nothing particular, said Scrooge. Something, I think, the ghost insisted. No, said Scrooge. No, I should like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk just now, that's all. His former self turned down the lamps as he gave utterance to the wish, and Scrooge and the ghost again stood side by side in the open air. My time grows short, observed the spirit. Quick. This was not addressed to Scrooge, or to any other whom he could see, but it produced an immediate effect. For again Scrooge saw himself. He was older now, a man in the prime of his life. His face had not the harsh and rigid lines of later years, but it had begun to wear the signs of care and avarice. There was an eager, greedy, restless motion in his eye, which showed the passion had taken root, and where the shadow of the growing trees would fall. He was not alone, but sat by the side of a fair young girl in a mourning dress, in whose eyes there were tears, which sparkled in the light that shone out of the ghost of Christmas past. It matters little, she said softly. To you, very little. Another idol has displaced me, and if it can cheer and comfort you in time to come, as I would have tried to do, I would just cause to grieve. What idol has displaced you? He rejoined. A golden one. This is the even-handed dealing of the world, he said. There is nothing of which is so hard as poverty. There is nothing it professes to condemn with such severity as the pursuit of wealth. You feel the world too much, she answered gently. All your other hopes have merged into the hope of being beyond the chance of its sordid reproach. I have seen your nobler aspirations fall off one by one until the master passion, gain, engrosses you. Have I not? What then? He retorted. Even if I have grown so much wiser, what then? Am I not changed towards you? She shook her head. Am I? Our contract is an old one. It was made when we were both poor and content to be so, until in good season we could improve our worldly fortune by our patient industry. You are changed. When it was made, you were another man. I was a boy, he said impatiently. Your own feelings tells you that we were not what you are, she returned. I am. That which promised happiness when we were one in heart is fraught with misery now that we are two. How often and how keenly I have thought of this, I will not say. It is enough that I have thought of it and can release you. Have I ever sought release? In words, no, never. In what, then? In changed nature, in an altered spirit, in another atmosphere of life, another hope at its great end, in everything that had made my love of any worth or value in your sight. If this had ever been between us, said the girl, looking mildly but with steadiness upon him, tell me, would you seek me out and try to win me now? Ah, no. He seemed to yield to the justice at the supposition, in spite of himself, but he said, with a struggle, You think not? I would gladly think otherwise if I could, she answered. Heaven knows! When I have learned a truth like this, I know how strong and irresistible it must be. But if you were free today, tomorrow, yesterday, can even I believe you would choose a dowerless girl who, in your very confidence with her, weigh everything by gain? Or choosing her, if for a moment you were false enough to your own guiding principle to do so? Do I not know that your repentance and regret would surely follow? I do, and I release you, with a full heart, for the love of him you once were. He was about to speak, but with her head turned away from him, she resumed, You may, the memory of what is past half makes me hope you will, have pain in this, a very, very brief time, and you will dismiss the recollection of it, gladly, as an unprofitable dream, from which it happened, well that you awoke. May you be happy in the life you have chosen. She left him, and they parted. Spirit, said Scrooge, show me no more. Conduct me home. Why do you delight to torture me? One more shadow, exclaimed the ghost. No more! Cried Scrooge. No more! I don't wish to see it! Show me no more! But the restless spirit pinioned himself in both his arms and forced him to observe what happened next. They were in another scene, a place, a room, not very large or handsome, but full of comfort. Near to the winter fire sat a beautiful young girl, so like the last that Scrooge believed it was the same, until he saw her, now a comely matron, sitting in opposite her daughter. The noise in his room was perfectly tumultuous, for there was more children there than Scrooge in his agitated state of mind could count, and, unlike the celebrated herd in the poem, there were not 40 children conducting themselves like one, but every child was conducting itself like 40. The consequences were uproarious beyond belief, but not one seeming to care. On the contrary, the mother and daughter laughed heartily and enjoyed it very much, and the latter, soon beginning to mingle in the sports, got pillaged by the younger brigands most ruthlessly. What would I not have given to be one of them? Though I never could have been so rude, no, I wouldn't, and for the weather, all the world have crushed the braided hair and torn it down. For the precious little shoe, I wouldn't have plucked it off. God bless my soul. To save my life. As measuring her waist in sport as they did, young bold brood, I couldn't have done it. I should have expected my arm to have grown round it for a punishment, and never come straight again. And yet I should have dearly liked, I own, to have touched her lips, and have questioned her, that she might have opened them, to have looked upon the lashes of her downcast eyes, and never raised a blush, to have let loose waves of hair. Any inch would have been keepsake beyond its price. In short, I would have liked, I do confess, to have had the lightest license of a child, and yet be a man enough to know its value. I guess Charles Dickens really wants kids. That's what it sounds from this story. But anyway, Let's see. But now, at a knocking at the door was heard. Such a rush immediately ensued that she, with a laughing face, plundered her dress, borne towards it, and the center of a flushed and boisterous group, just in time to greet the father, who had come home attended by a man laden with Christmas toys and presents. Then the shouting and struggling, and the onslaught that were made on the defenseless porter, the scaling of him with chairs and ladders to dive into his pockets, to spoil him of brown paper parcels, hold on tight with his cravat, hug him round the neck and pummel his pack, kick his legs in irrepressible affection. The shouts of wonder and delight with which the development of every package was received. The terrible announcement that the baby had been taken in the act of pulling a doll's putting a frying pan in its mouth, and was more than suspected of having swallowed a fictitious turkey glued on a wooden platter. The immense relief of finding this false alarm, the joy and gratitude and ecstasy, they were all indescribable alike. It is enough that by degrees the children in their emotions got out of the parlor, and by one stair at a time, up to the top of the house, where they went to bed, and so subsided. And now Scrooge looked on more attentively than ever, when the master of the house, having his daughter leaning fondly on him, sat down with her and her mother on his own fireside, and when he thought that such another creature, quite as graceful and full of promise, might have called him father, and been springtime in the haggard of winter of his life, his sight grew very dim indeed. "Belle," said the husband, turning to his wife with a smile, "I saw an old friend of yours this afternoon. Who was it? Guess. How can I? Tut, don't I know?" She added in the same breath, laughed and laughed. "Mr. Scrooge!" Mr. Scrooge it was. I passed his office window, and it was not shut up, and he had a candle inside. I could scarcely help seeing him. His partner lies beyond the point of death, I hear, and there he sat alone. Quite alone in the world, I do believe. "Spirit," said Scrooge in a broken voice, "remove me from this place." "I told you these were shadows of things that have been," said the ghost. "That they are what they are. Do not blame me." "Remove me!" Scrooge exclaimed. "I cannot bear it!" He turned upon the ghost, and seeing that it looked upon him with a face in which some strange way there were fragments of all the faces it had showed him, wrestled with it. "Leave me! Take me back! Haunt me no more!" In the struggle, if there can be called a struggle in which the ghost was with no visible resistance on its own part, was undisturbed by any effort in adversary, Scrooge observed that its light was burning high and bright, dimly connected with its influence over him, and he seized the extinguisher cap, and with a sudden action pressed it down upon its head. The spirit dropped beneath it, so that the extinguisher covered its whole form, and though Scrooge pressed down on it with all force, he could not hide the light, which streamed from under it, and in an unbroken flood upon the ground. He was conscious of being exhausted and overcome by irresistible drowsiness, and the further of being in his own bedroom, he gave the cap a parting squeeze, in which his hand relaxed, and the bear time to reel to bed before he sank into a heavy sleep. All right, folks, and thus completes Stave 2. Next week, we're going to continue reading Stave 3, which is the second of the three spirits, better known as the Ghost of Christmas Past. Well, you know what? I see a third person joined us just now, and this is one of my favorite parts of the book. So, You know what? There is going to be eventually a day where I have to make up by reading more. So you know what? What the heck? We're going to read Stave 3 as well. We'll make it a long stream. I'm going to take another sip of this cranberry juice and we're going to continue on. We're doing it live. Fuck it. We'll dogtail it and we'll do it live. All right. Stave 3. The second of the three spirits. Awakening in the middle of a prodigious tough snore, sitting up in bed to get his thoughts together, Scrooge had no occasion to be told that the bell was again upon the stroke of 1. He felt that he was restored to consciousness in the right nick of time for the especial purpose of holding a conference with a second messenger dispatched to him through Jacob Marley's intervention. But finding that he turned uncomfortably cold when he began to wonder which of his curtains this new spectre would draw back, he put every one aside with his own hands, and lying down again, established a sharp lookout all around the bed. For he wished to challenge the spirit on the moment of its appearance, and did not wish to be taken by surprise and made nervous. Gentlemen of the free and easy sort, who plume themselves on being acquainted with a move or two, and being unusually equal to time of day, express the wide range of their capacity for adventure by observing that they are good for anything for which pitch and toss to manslaughter, between which opposite extremes, no doubt, there lies a tolerably wide and comprehensive range of subjects. Without venturing for Scrooge quite as heartily as this, I don't mind calling on you to believe that he was ready for a good broad field of strange appearances, and that nothing between a baby and a rhinoceros would have astonished him very much. Now, being prepared for almost anything, he was not by any means prepared for nothing, and consequently when the bell struck 1, and no shape appeared, he was taken with a violent fit of trembling. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour went by, yet nothing came. All this time he lay upon his bed, and the very core and center of a blaze of a ruddy light which streamed upon wait, one moment. Sorry, I misread that. The very core and center of a... Did I skip a page? No, I didn't. A blaze of ruddy light which streamed upon it when the clock proclaimed the hour, and which, being only light, was more alarming than a dozen ghosts, and he was powerless to make out what it meant, or what it would be, and was sometimes apprehensive that he might be at the very moment an interesting case of spontaneous combustion, without having the consolation of knowing it. At last, however, he began to think, as you or I would have thought at first, for it is always the person, and not in predicament, who knows what ought to have been done in it, and would unquestionably have done it too. At last, I say, he began to think that the source and secret of his ghostly light might be in the adjoining room, from whence, on further tracing it, it seemed to shine. This idea taking full possession of his mind, he got up softly and shuffled in his slippers to the door. The moment Scrooge's hand was on the lock, a strange voice called him by his name, and bade him in. He obeyed. It was his own room. There was no doubt about that. But it had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceilings were so hung with living green that it looked like a perfect grove, from every part which bright gleaming berries glistened. The crisp leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light as if so many little mirrors had been scattered there, and much of a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney, as the dull petrification of the hearth had never known in Scrooge's time or Marley's, for many and many a winter gone. heaped upon the floor to form a kind of throne, were turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, great joints of meat, sucking pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense 12th cakes, and seething bowls of punch that made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. In ease of state upon the couch there sat a jolly giant, glorious to see. He bore a glowing torch, in shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and held it up high to shed its light on Scrooge, which came peeping around the door. "Come in!" exclaimed the ghost. "Come in and know me better, man." Scrooge entered in timidly, and hung his head before the spirit. He was not the dogged Scrooge he had been, and though his eyes were clear and kind, he did not like to meet them. Excuse me. "I am the ghost of Christmas present," said the spirit. "Look upon me." Scrooge reverently did so. It was clothed in one simple deep green robe, or mantle, bordered with light white fur. The garment hung so loosely on the figure that its capacious breast was bare, as if disdaining to be warden or concealed with an artifice. Its feet, unobservable beneath the ample folds of the garment, were also bare, and on its head wore no other covering with a holly wreath set here and there with shining icicles. Its dark brown curls were long and free as its genial face, its sparkling eye, its open hand, its cheery voice, its unconstrained demeanor, and its joyful air. Girded around its middle was an antique scabbard, but no sword was in it, and the ancient sheath was eaten up with rust. "You have never seen the like of me before," explained the spirit. "Never," made Scrooge to answer it. "Have never walked forth with the younger members of my family, meaning, for I am very young, my elder brother is born in these later years?" pursued the phantom. "I don't think I have," said Scrooge. "I'm afraid not. Do you have many brothers, spirit?" "More than 1,800, said the Scrooge. "A tremendous family to provide for," muttered Scrooge. The ghost of Christmas present rose. "Spirit," said Scrooge submissively, "conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion and learnt a lesson which is working now. Tonight, if you had aught to teach me, let me profit by it. Touch my robe." Scrooge did, and as he was told, and held it fast. Holly, mistletoe, red berries, ivy, turkey, geese, game, poultry, brawn, meat, pigs, sausages, oysters, pies, puddings, fruit, and punch all vanished instantly. So did the room, and the fire, and the ruddy glow. The hour of night, and they stood in the city streets on Christmas morning, where, for the weather was severe, the people made a rough but brisk, not unpleasant kind of music in scraping the snow from the pavement in front of their dwellings, and from the top of their houses, whence it was mad delight to the boys to see it come plumping down in the road below, was splitting into artificial little snowstorms. The house fronts looked black enough, and the windows blacker, contrasting with the smooth white sheet of snow upon the roofs, with the dirtier snow upon the ground, which last deposit had been plowed up in deep furrows by heavy wheels of carts and wagons, furrows that crossed and recrossed each other hundreds of times when the great streets branched off and made intricate channels, hard to trace in the thick yellow mud and icy water. The sky was gloomy, and the shortest streets were chalked up with dingy mist, half-thawed, frozen, whose weathered particles descended in showers of sooty atoms, as if all the chimneys in Great Britain had, by one consent, caught fire and were blazing away to their dear hearts' content. There was nothing very cheerful in the climate or the town, yet was there an air of cheerfulness abroad to the cheeriest summer air and brightest summer sun might have endeavored to diffuse in vain. For the people who were shoveling away on the housetops were jovial and full of glee, calling out to one another from the parapets, and now and then exchanging a facetious snowball, better-natured missile far than many a worldly jest, laughing heartily if it went right, and not less heartily if it went wrong. The poulterers' shops were still half open, and the fruiters were radiant in their glory. There were great, round, pot-bellied baskets of chestnuts, shaped like waistcoats of jolly old gentlemen, lolling at the doors, tumbling out into the streets in their apoplectic opulence. Sorry, I'm turning the page. There were ruddy, brown-faced, broad-girded Spanish onions, shining in the fatness of their growth like Spanish friars, and winking from the shelves in wanton slyness at the girls as they went by, and glanced demurely at the hung-up mistletoe. There were pears and apples, clustered high in blooming pyramids. There were bunches of grapes, made in the shopkeep's benevolence to dangle from conspicuous hooks, that people's mouths might water gratis as they passed. And there were piles of filberts. If you don't know, filberts are hazelnuts, another word for hazelnuts. There are piles of filberts, mossy and brown, recalling in their fragrance ancient walks among the woods and pleasant shufflings ankle deep through withered leaves. And there were Norfolk biffins, squab and swarth, setting off the yellow of the oranges and lemons, and in the great compactness of their juicy persons, urgently entreating and beseeching to be carried home in paper bags and eaten after dinner. The very gold and silver fish set forth among the choicest fruit in the bowl, though members of dull and stagnant bloodied race appeared to know that there was something going on, and to a fish, when gasping round and round their little world in slow and pointless excitement. The grocers, the grocers, nearly closed within perhaps 2 shutters down or 1, but through those gaps such glimpses. It was not alone that scales descended on the counter made a merry sound, or that the twine and roller parted company so briskly, or that the canisters rattled up and down like juggling tricks, or even the blended scents of tea and coffee were so grateful to the nose, and even the raisins were so plentiful and rare, the almonds so extremely white, the sticks of cinnamon so long and straight, and other spices so delicious, the candied fruits so caked and spotted with molten sugar to make the coldest lookers-on feel faint and subsequently bilious. Nor was it that the figs were moist and plump, or that the French plums blushed in modest tartness from their highly decorated boxes, or that everything was good to eat in its Christmas dress, but the customers were all so hurried and so eager in the hopeful promise of the day that they tumbled up against each other at the door, crashing their wicker baskets wildly, and left their purchases upon the counter, came running back to fetch them, and committed hundreds of the alike mistakes in the best humor possible, while the grocer and his people were so frank and fresh that they polished hearts with which they fastened their aprons behind might have been their own, wore outside for general inspection, and for Christmas daws to peck in those that they chose. But soon the steeples called good people all to church and chapel, and away they came, flocking through the streets in their best clothes and with their gayest faces. And at the same time there emerged from scores of by-streets, lanes, and nameless turnings innumerable people, carrying their dinners to the bakers' shops. The sight of these poor revelers appeared to interest the spirit very much, for he stood with Scrooge beside him in a baker's doorway, and taking off the covers as the bearers passed, sprinkled license on their dinner from his torch. Sprinkled incense on their dinners from his torch, and it was a very uncommon kind of torch, from which once or twice there was an angry word between some dinner carriers who had jostled with each other. He shed a few drops of water on them, and the good humor was restored directly. For they said it was a shame to quarrel upon Christmas Day, and so it was. God love it, so it was. In time the bells ceased, and the bakers were shut up, and yet there was a genial shadowing forth of all dinners and progress of their cooking. And the thawed blotch of wet who above each baker's oven, where the pavement smoked as if the stones were cooking too. Is there a peculiar flavor in what you sprinkled from your torch? asked Scrooge. There is, my own. Would it apply to any kind of dinner on this day? Asked Scrooge. To any kindly given. To a poor one most. Why to a poor one most? Asked Scrooge. Because it needs it most. Spirit, said Scrooge after a moment's thought. I wonder you, of all the beings in the many worlds about us, should desire to cramp these people's opportunities of innocent enjoyment. Aye, cried the spirit, you would deprive them of their means of dining every 7th day, often the only day on which they can be said to dine at all, said Scrooge. Would you? Would you? Aye, cried the spirit. You seek to close those places on the 7th day, said Scrooge. As I come to the same thing, I seek, explained the spirit. Forgive me if I am wrong. It has been done in your name, and at least in that of your family, said Scrooge. There are some upon this earth of yours, returned the spirit, who lay claim to know us, who do their deeds of passion, pride, ill will, hatred, envy, bigotry, and selfishness in our name, who are as strange to us as all our kith and kin, as if they had never lived. Remember that, and charge their doings on themselves, not us. I always liked that line. Anyway, Scrooge promised that he would, and they went on invisible, as they had been before, into suburbs of the town. It was a remarkable quality of the ghost, which Scrooge had observed at the baker's, that notwithstanding his gigantic size, he could accommodate himself to any place with ease, and that he stood beneath a low roof as graceful and like supernatural creature as if it was as possible he could have done it at any lofty hall. And perhaps it was the pleasure of the good spirit had it showing off its power or his, or else it was his own kind, generous, hardy nature, and his sympathy with all poor men, that led him straight to Scrooge's clerks, for there he went and took Scrooge with him, holding his robe, and on threshold of the door the spirit smiled, and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with the sprinklings of his torch. Think of that! Bob was but 15 bob a week himself. He pocketed on Saturdays but 15 copies of his Christian name, and yet the ghost of Christmas present blessed his 4-roomed house. Then up rose Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, but brave in ribbons, which are cheap and made a goodly show for sixpence. And she laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes, and getting the corner of his monstrous collar-shirt, Bob's private property, conferred upon his son, an heir in honor of the day, into his mouth, rejoiced to find himself so gallantly attired, and yearned to show his linen in the fashionable parks. And now 2 smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelt the goose and known it for their own, and basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion. The young Cratchits danced about the table, exalted Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, while he, not proud although his collar nearly choked him, blew the fire until the slow potatoes bubbling up, knocking loudly on the sauce lid to be let out and peeled. "What has ever got your precious father, then?" said Mrs. Cratchit, "and your brother, Tiny Tim? And Martha weren't as late last Christmas by half an hour." "Here's Martha, mother," said a girl, appearing as she spoke. "Here's Martha, mother," cried the 2 young Cratchits. "Hurrah! There's such a goose, Martha." "Why, bless your heart alive, my dear, how late you are," said Miss Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times and taking off her shawl and bonnet for her officious seal. "We'd a deal of work to finish up last night," replied the girl, "and had to clear away this morning, mother." "Well, never mind so long you are to come," said Miss Cratchit. Cratchit, sit ye down before the fire, my dear. Have a warm, Lord bless ye." No, there's father coming," cried the 2 young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. "Hide, Martha, hide!" So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob, father, with at least 3 feet of comforter exclusive on the fringe, hanging down before him, and his little threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim, he wore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. "Why, where's our Martha?" cried Bob Cratchit, looking around. "Not coming," said Miss Cratchit. "Not coming?" said Bob, with a sudden declension in his high spirits, as he had been Tiny Tim's blood horse all the way from church, and had come home rampant. "Not coming upon Christmas Day?" Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, if it were only a joke, so she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms, while the 2 young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him into the wash-house, that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. "How did little Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit, as she rallied Bob on his credulity. And Bob hugged his daughter to his heart's content. "As good as gold," said Bob, "and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful, sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me, coming home, they had hoped the people saw him in the church, because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see." Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hardy. His active little crutch had hurried upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool beside the fire. And while Bob, turning up his cuffs, as if, poor fellow, there was capable of being made more shabby, compounded some hot mixture into a jar with gin and lemons, and stirred it round and put it in the hob to simmer. Master Peter and the two ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. Such a bustle ensued that you might have thought a goose the rarest of all birds, a feathered phenomenon, to which a black swan was a matter of course, and in truth was something very like it in the house. Miss Cratchit made the gravy, ready beforehand in the little saucepan, and hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigor. Miss Belinda sweetened up the applesauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner at the table, and the two young Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves, and mounting guard upon their posts, crammed spoons into their mouths, lest they should shriek for the goose before they turn came to be helped. At last the dishes were set on, and grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause, as Miss Cratchit, looking slowly all along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it into the breast. And when she did, and the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose all around the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat on the table with the handle of his knife, and feebly cried, "Hurrah!" There never was such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there was ever such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavor, size and cheapness were the themes of a universal admiration. Eked out by the applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Miss Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one atom of bone upon the dish, that they hadn't eaten it all at last. Yet every one had enough. The youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. But now the plates were being changed by Belinda, and Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witness, to take the pudding up and bring it in. Now I will tell you, I have had pudding, like Christmas pudding. It is incredibly boozy. Like, there's a lot of alcohol that goes into it. Like figgy pudding is what I'm talking about. It was okay, but you could taste it tasted like straight brandy. But anyway, suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Suppose somebody would have got all over the wall. Should have got over the wall of the backyard and stolen it while they were merry with the goose, a supposition at which the two young Cratchits became livid. All sorts of horrors were supposed. Hello! A great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. A smell like a washing day. There was the cloth. A smell like an eating house, and a pastries cook next door to each other, with a laundresses next door to that, and there was the pudding. In a half a minute Miss Cratchit entered, flushed, but smiling proudly, with the pudding, like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, and blazing in half a quartern of ignited brandy, and bedight in the Christmas holly stuck into the top. Oh, a wonderful pudding. Bob Cratchit said, and calmly too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Miss Cratchit said that now the weight was off her mind, and should confess that she had her doubts about the quantity of flour. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought of it as at all a small pudding for a large family. It would have been flat heresy to do so. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. At last the dinner was done. The cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, the fire made up. The compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect, apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. and when the Cratchit family drew around the hearth in what Cratchit called a circle, meaning half a one, and at Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers, and a custard cup without a handle. There held this hot stuff from the jug. However, as well as golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and crackled noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us," which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us, every one," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool, and Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might have been taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge, with an interest he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." "Oh, no, no," Scrooge said. "Oh, no, kind spirit. Say he will be spared." "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race," returned the ghost, "will find him here. What then? If he be to die, then he had better do it, and decrease the surplus population." Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit, and overcome with penitence and grief. "Man," said the ghost, "if man you be in heart, not adamant, forbear that wicked cant until you have been discovered what the surplus is, and where it is. Will you decide what men shall live, and what men shall die?" Scrooge annex. Yeah. Well, I think Malthus, who was like the guy who kind of like helped birth that sort of thought process, like he existed like I think before A Christmas Carol, which I mean the Christmas Carol was like very much like a counter statement of that. But anyway, "It may be in the slight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. Oh God, to hear the insect on the leaf pronouncing on to too much life among his hungry brothers in the dust." Scrooge bent before the ghost's rebuke, and trembling cast his eye upon the ground, but he raised them speedily on hearing his own name. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob. "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "Founder of the feast, indeed," said Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. "I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it." "My dear," said Bob, "the children. Christmas Day." "It should be Christmas Day, I'm sure," she said, "on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know how he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, poor fellow." "My dear," said Scrooge, mild answer, "Christmas Day." "I'll drink his health for your sake in the days," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not for his. Long life to him, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. We'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt." The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings which had no heartiness in it. Tiny Tim drank it all at last, but he didn't care 2 pence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for a full 5 minutes. After it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before, from the mere relief of Scrooge the baleful being done with. Bob Cratchit told them how he had a situation in his eye for Master Peter, which would bring in, if obtained, full 5 and 6 pence a week. The two young Cratchits laughed tremendously at the idea of Peter being a man of business, and Peter himself looked thoughtfully at the fire from between his collars, as if he were deliberating what particular investment he should favor when it came to a receipt of the bewildering income. Martha, who was a poor apprentice at a miller's, they told what kind of work she had to do, and how many hours she worked at a stretch, and how she meant to lie abed tomorrow morning for a good long rest, tomorrow being a holiday she passed at home, and how she would have seen a countess and a lord some days before, and how the lord was much about as tall as Peter, at which Peter pulled his collar so high that you couldn't have seen his head if you had been there. All this time the chestnuts in the jug went round and round, and by they had a song, and although a lost child traveling in the snow, from Tiny Tim, and who had a plaintive little voice, sang it very well indeed. There was nothing of high mark in it. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof, and their clothes were scanty, and Peter might have known, and very likely did, the inside of a pawnbroker's. But they were happy, grateful, and pleased with each other, and contented with the time, and when they faded, they looked happier yet in the bright sparkling of the spirit's torch at parting. Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim, until the last. At this time it was getting dark, and snowing pretty heavily, and as Scrooge and the spirit went along the streets, the brightness of the roaring fires in kitchens, parlors, and all sorts of rooms were wonderful. Here the flickering of the blaze showed preparations for a cozy dinner, with hot plates baking through and through before the fire, and deep red curtains, red to be drawn to shut out cold and darkness. There all the children of the house were running out into the snow to meet their married sisters, brothers, cousins, uncles, aunts, and to be the first to greet them. Here again were shadows on the window blind of guest assemblies, and there a group of handsome girls, all hooded and fur-booted, and all chattering at once, tipped lightly off to some near neighbor's house, where, woe upon the single man who saw them enter, artful witches, they knew it, in a glow. But if you had judged from the number of people on their way to friendly gatherings, you may have thought that no one was at home to give them a welcome when they got there. Instead of every house expecting company and piling up its fires half chimney high. Blessings on it, how the ghost exulted! How it bared its breadth of breast, and opened its capacious palm, and floated on, outpouring with a generous hand its bright and harmless mirth on everything within its reach. The very lamplighter who ran on before, dotting the dusky streets with specks of light, who had dressed to spend the evening somewhere, laughed out loudly as the spirit passed. Though the little Ken and the lamplighter that had a company but Christmas. Now, without a word of warning from the ghost, they stood upon a bleak and desert moor, where monstrous masses of rude stone were cast about, as though if it were the burial place of giants. And water spread itself wherever it listed, or would have done so, but for the frost that held its prisoner, and nothing grew but moss and furze and coarse, rank grass. Down in the west the settling sun had left a streak of fiery red, which glared upon the desolation for an instant, like a sullen eye, and frowning lower, lower, lower yet, was long in the thick gloom of darkest night. "What place is this?" asked Scrooge. "A place where miners live, who labor in bowels of the earth," returned the spirit. "But they know me. See." Moment, I want to check something. Okay. This is a very long chapter, so I'm glad that I'm reading this now. A light shone from the window of a hut, and swiftly they advanced towards it. Passing through the wall of mud and stone, they found a cheerful company assembled round a glowing fire. An old man and woman, with their children and their children's children, and another generation beyond that, all decked out gaily in their holiday attire. The old man, in a voice that seldom rose above the howling of the wind upon the barren waste, was singing them a Christmas song. It had been a very old song when he was a boy, and from time to time they all joined in the chorus. So surely as they raised their voices, the old man got quite blithe and loud, and so surely as they stopped, his vigor sank again. The spirit did not tarry here, but bade Scrooge hold his robe, and passing above of the moor, spend whither. Not to see, to see. To Scrooge's horror, looking back, he saw the last of the land, a strange range of docks behind him, with his ears being deafened by the thundering of water, as if rolled and roared and raged on the dreadful caverns of its worn and fiercely tried to undermine the earth. Until, built upon a dismal reef of sunken rocks, some league or so from shore, on which the waters chafed and dashed the wild year through, they stood at a solitary lighthouse. Great heaps of seaweed clung to its base, and a storm-bird, borne upon the wind, one might suppose, as seaweed of the water, and rose and fell upon it like the waves they skimmed. But even here 2 men who watched the light and made a fire, and though the loophole in the... I gotta change the page here. This page likes to stick together. And though the loophole of the thick stone wall shut out a ray of brightness on the awful sea, joining their horny hands over the rough table on which they sat, they wished each other Merry Christmas in their can of grog, and one of them, the elder 2, with his face all damaged and scarred with hard weather, as the figurehead of an old ship might be, struck up a sturdy song that was like a gale in itself. Again the ghost sped on above the black and heaving sea, on and on, until being far away, as he told Scrooge, from any shore that lighted a ship, they stood behind the helmsman at wheel, and looking out in the bow, the officers who had the watch, dark ghostly figures in their several stations, but every man and among them hummed a Christmas tune, and had a Christmas thought, or spoke below his breath to his companion of some bygone Christmas day, with homeward hopes belonging to it. And every man on board, waking or sleeping, good or bad, had a kinder word for another that day than any other day in the year, and had shared to some extent in its festivities, and had remembered those he cared for or at a distance, and had known that they delighted to remember him. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while listening to the moaning of the wind, and thinking what a solemn thing it was to move on through the lonely darkness over an unknown abyss, whose depths were secrets as profound as death. It was great surprise to Scrooge, while thus engaged, to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognize that it was his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the spirit standing smiling by his side, and looking at the same nephew with approving affability. "Ha ha!" laughed Scrooge's nephew. "Ha ha ha ha!" If you would have happened, by the unlikely chance, to know a man more blessed in a laugh than Scrooge's nephew, all I can say is I should like to know him too. Introduce him to me, and I'll cultivate his acquaintance. It is a fair, even-handed, noble adjustment of things that while there is an infection and disease and and a sorrow, there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humor. When Scrooge's nephew laughed in this way, holding his sides, rolling his head, and twisting his face into the most extravagant contortions, Scrooge's niece, by marriage, laughed as heartily as he, and their assembled friends, being not a bit behindhand, roared up lustily. "Ha ha 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 ha!" "He said that Christmas was a humbug, as I live!" cried Scrooge's nephew. "He believed it, too!" "More shame for him, Fred," said Scrooge's niece indignantly. "Bless those women that never do anything by halves. They're always in earnest." She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with a dimpled, surprisingly looking, capital face, a ripe little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, as no doubt it was, all kinds of good little dots about her chin that melted into another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in any creature's head. Although she was what you would have called provoking, you know, but satisfactory, too. Oh, perfectly satisfactory. "He's a comical old fellow," said Scrooge's nephew. "That's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might he. However, his offences carry their own punishment, as I have nothing to say against him." "I'm sure he is very rich, Fred," hinted Scrooge's niece. "At least you always tell me so." "What of that, my dear?" said Scrooge's nephew. "His health is of no use to him. His wealth is of no use to him. He don't do any good with it. He don't make himself comfortable with it. He hasn't the satisfaction of thinking that he is going to benefit us with it." "I have no patience with him," observed Scrooge's niece. Scrooge's niece's sisters, all the other ladies, expressed the same opinion. "Oh, I have," said Scrooge's nephew. "I am sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers with all his ill whims? Himself, always. Here he takes it to his head to dislike us, and he won't come in and dine with us. What's the consequence? He doesn't lose so much as a dinner." "Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner," interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everybody else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges, because they had a dinner with dessert upon the table, were clustered around the fire by lamplight. "Well, I am very glad to hear it," said Scrooge's nephew, "because I haven't heard faith in these young housekeepers. What do you say, Topper?" Topper had clearly got his eye upon one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, for he answered that a bachelor was a wretched outcast who had no right to express an opinion on the subject. Whereat Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one with the lace tucker, not the one with the roses, blushed. "Do go on, Fred," said Scrooge's niece, clapping her hands. "He never finishes what he begins to say. He is such a ridiculous fellow." Scrooge's nephew revelled in another laugh, and as if it were impossible to keep the infection through the plump sister, tried hard to do it with aromatic vinegar. His example was unanimously followed. "I was only going to say," said Scrooge's nephew, "that the consequence of his taking a dislike to us and making merry with us is, as I think, that he loses some pleasant moments which could do him no harm." I'm sure he loses pleasanter companions than he could find in his own thoughts, either in his moldy old office or his dusty chambers. I mean to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He may rail at Christmas till he dies, but he can't think better of it. I defy him. If he finds me going there in good temper year after year and saying, Uncle Scrooge, how are you? If it only puts him in the vein to leave his poor clerk £50, that's something. I think I shook him yesterday. It was their turn to laugh now at the notion of his shaking Scrooge, but being thoroughly good-natured and not much caring what they laughed at, so that they laughed at any rate, he encouraged them in their merriment and passed the bottle joyously. After tea they had some music, for they were a musical family and knew what they were about when they sung glee or catch, I can assure you, especially Topper, who could growl away in the bass like a good one, never swell the large veins in his forehead and get red in the face over it. Scrooge's niece played well upon the harp, and played among other tunes in simple little air, a mere nothing you might learn to whistle in 2 minutes, which had been familiar to the child who fetched Scrooge from the boarding school, as he had been reminded by the ghost of Christmas past. When a strain of music sounded, all the things that the ghost had shown him came upon his mind. He softened more and more, and thought if he could have listened to it often, years ago, he might have cultivated the kindness of life for his own happiness with his own hands, without restoring the sexton's spade and the buried Jacob Marley. But they didn't devote the whole evening to music. After a while they played at forfeits, for it's good to be children sometimes, and never better at Christmas, when its mighty founder was a child himself. Stop! There was first a game of blindman's buff. Of course there was, and I no more believe Topper was really blind than I believe he had eyes in his boots. My opinion is that it was a done thing between him and Scrooge's nephew, and that the ghost of Christmas present knew it. They never went after the plump sister, and the way he went after the plump sister and the lace tucker was an outrage with credulity of human nature, knocking down on the fire irons, tumbling over the chairs, bumping up against the piano, smothering himself among the curtains. Wherever she went, there he was. He always knew where the plump sister was. He couldn't catch anybody else. If you had fallen up against him, as someone did, and stood there, he would have made a feint of endeavoring to seize you, which would have been an affront to your understanding, and would instantly have sidled off into the erectus of the plump sister. She often cried out that it wasn't fair, and it really wasn't. But when at last he caught her, when, in spite of her silken rustlings and rapid flutterings past him, he got her into a corner whence there was no escape, and then his conduct was the most inexorable, for he pretended not knowing her, he pretended that it was necessary to touch her headdress, and, further, to address himself as her identity by pressing a certain ring upon her finger and certain chain upon her neck, was vile, monstrous. No doubt she told her opinion of it, and another blind man being in the office, they were so very confidential together behind the curtains. Scrooge's niece was not one of the blind man's bluff party, but was made comfortable with a large chair and a footstool in a snug corner where the ghost and Scrooge were close behind her. But she joined in the forfeits, and loved her love to admiration with all the letters of the alphabet. Likewise, at the game of how, when, and where, she was great, and to the secret joy of Scrooge's nephew beat her sisters hollow, though they were sharp girls too, as Topper would have told you. There might have been 20 people there, young and old, and they all played, and so did Scrooge, for wholly forgetting an interest he had in what was going on, that his voice made no sound in their ears. He sometimes came out with his guess quite loud, and very often guessed right, too, for the sharp as needle, best Whitechapel, warranted not to cut it in his eye, was not sharper than Scrooge, blunt as he took it in his head to be. The ghost was greatly pleased to find him in this mood, and looked upon him with such favor that he begged like a boy to be allowed to stay until the guests parted. But the spirit said it could not be done. "Here is a new game," said Scrooge. "1 half-hour, spirit, only one." It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must find out what. He only answered their questions with yes or no, as the case was. The brisk fire of questions to which was exposed elicited from him what he was thinking of: an animal, a live animal, a rather disagreeable animal, a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes, and talked sometimes, and lived in London, walked about the streets, wasn't made a show of, and wasn't led by anybody, didn't live in a menagerie, and was never killed in a market, and was not a horse, an ass, a cow, or a bull, or a tiger, or a dog, or a pig, or a cat, or a bear. And every fresh question that was put to him, his nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter, and was so inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to get off of the sofa and stamp. At last the plump sister, falling into the similar state, cried out, "I found it! I know what it is, Fred! I know what it is!" "What is it?" cried Fred. "It's your Uncle Scrooge!" Which it certainly was. Admiration was the universal sentiment, though some objected to the reply, "Is it a bear?" ought to have been yes, inasmuch as an answer in the negative was sufficient to be diverted to have diverted their thoughts from Mr. Scrooge, supposing that he had any tendency that way. "He has given us plenty of merriment, I am sure," said Fred, "and it would be ungrateful not to drink to his health. Here is a glass of mulled wine ready to our hand at the moment, and I say Uncle Scrooge." "Well, Uncle Scrooge," they cried. "A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man, wherever he is," said Scrooge's nephew. "He wouldn't take it from me, but may have it nevertheless. Uncle Scrooge." Nephew screamed. "An animal that growled and grunted and talked sometimes, that'd be me." "But you said it wasn't an ass." "Well, it wasn't a skeleton either, Tommy." Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly become so gay and light of heart that he would have pledged the unconscious company in return, and thanked them in inaudible speech if the ghost had taken him time. But the whole scene passed off in the breath of last words spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirit were again upon their travels. Much they saw, and far they went, and many houses they visited, but always with a happy end. The spirit stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful on foreign lands, and they were close at home by struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope by poverty, and it was rich. In almshouse, hospital, in jail, in misery's every refuge, where vain men in little brief authority had not made fast the door, barred the spirit out, he left his blessing, and taught Scrooge his precepts. It was a long night. It was a long night, if it were only a night. But Scrooge had his doubts of this, because the Christmas holiday appeared to have condensed into the space of time that passed together. It was strange, too, that while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew older, clearly older. Scrooge had observed this change, but never spoke of it until they left the children's 12th night party, when, looking at the spirit, they stood together there in an open place. He noticed that his hair was gray. "Are spirits' life so short?" asked Scrooge. "My life upon this globe is very brief," replied the ghost. "It ends tonight." "Tonight?" cried Scrooge. "Tonight at midnight. Hark! The time is drawing near." The chimes were ringing the 3/4 past 11 at the moment. "Forgive me if I am not justified in what I ask," said Scrooge, looking intently at the spirit's robe, "but I see something strange and not belonging to yourself protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot or a claw?" "It might be a claw for the flesh there is upon it," the Scrooge sorrowfully replied. "Look here." From the folding of its robe it brought 2 children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They knelt down at its feet, clutching upon the outside of its garment. "Oh, man, look! Look here! Look! Look! Down here!" the ghost replied. There was a boy and a girl, yellow, meager, ragged, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate too in their humility. Where graceful youth should have filled their features out and touched them with its freshest tints, a stale and shriveled hand, like that of age, had pinched and twisted them and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked and glared out menacingly. No change, no degradation, no perversion of humanity in any grade, though all the miseries of wonderful creation has monsters half so horrible and dread. Annual prostate exam. Gosh, oh, darn it, Tommy. Anyway, Scrooge started back, appalled, having them shown to him in this way, and he tried to say that they were fine children, but the words choked themselves, rather than be parties to a lie of such enormous magnitude. "Spirit, are they yours?" Scrooge could say no more. "They are man's," said the spirit, looking down upon them. "They cling to me, appealing from their fathers. The boy is ignorance, the girl is want. Beware them both, and all of their degree, but most of all beware this boy, for on his brow I see written witch's doom, unless the writing be erased." "Deny it!" cried the spirit, stretching out his hand towards the city. "Slander those who tell it ye. Admit it for your facetious purpose, and make it worse, and bide the end." "Have they no refuge or resource?" cried the Scrooge. "Are there no prisons?" said the spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. "Are there no workhouses?" The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost, and saw it was not. And the last stroke ceased to vibrate. He remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting his eyes beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground towards him. All right, so next we have Stave 4, which is the last of the three spirits. So I'm going to stop here for now. I want to thank you all. Oh wow, this is a 2-hour stream. Quite an event here. I want to thank you all for joining me on this reading of A Christmas Carol. Next week I will continue. You know what? I think next week I'll finish it up. I'll read Stave 4 and Stave 5. to call it there, because after that week I'm going away for winter vacation. But I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your night. You too, Dami. I hope you get some good sleep. I hope this put you to sleep pretty well. Have a good night. Stay classy, stay sassy, stay grassy. I will see you next time. Bye-bye.